Welcome back, everyone, to Occult Archives. We're about to take another deep dive into, well, you could say, the books that make people a little nervous.
That's one way to put it. We're looking at the stories, the myths, even the legends behind those texts that, throughout history, some have considered a bit too potent, a bit too loaded to just be lying around for anyone to pick up.
Exactly. I mean, we're not talking about grimoires chained to library walls or anything like that, but, the kind of books that make you think twice before opening them up. And for episode 102, we're exploring one that you, our listeners, specifically asked us to take a closer look at. It's called The Master Mason's Handbook.
Written by J.S.M. Ward, and it's a fascinating one, really delving into the heart of Freemasonry's third degree, the Master Mason.
Yeah. And this isn't just a dry, how-to manual for the ceremonies. It's much more about the deeper spiritual instruction that Ward believed is embedded within this particular degree. He saw it as a pivotal point in a Mason's journey.
Oh, absolutely. He describes it as a great adventure, a search after that which was lost. He actually calls it the mystic quest, which is a pretty evocative way to put it.
I like that, the mystic quest. And what's really interesting is how Ward emphasizes that even people coming to this degree without a background in Freemasonry, those encountering this ritual for the first time, are often deeply affected by it. He says it right there in the preface. So there's clearly something going on here that resonates on a very deep level.
And right from the beginning, he makes it clear that this degree isn't just about, the outward rituals and the symbols. He's pointing towards a genuine inner spiritual journey. And he seems to suggest that the more deeply you engage with those teachings, the more accessible that ancient wisdom becomes.
So let's get into it, shall we? What are some of the key things that Ward highlights about this third degree?
Well, he starts by looking at the test questions that someone is asked before they can be raised to the level of a master mason. And he points out that these questions actually draw from the lessons and the imagery, those tracing boards, that were presented in the earlier degrees.
So it's building on what's already been established.
Exactly. It's not just a standalone thing. Think of it more like a progressive curriculum where each stage prepares you for the next.
And one of the key elements that he pulls from the earlier degrees is the concept of being admitted on the square in a second degree. And then he connects this to some, I have to say, pretty fundamental symbolism.
Yeah, the circle, for instance, which is often used to represent the infinite, God. And then if you were to take 4 squares and combine them in a very specific way within that circle, you get what's known as the cosmic cross. So the admission on the square is linking the individual to that much larger cosmic picture. It's their individual journey within the grand scheme of existence, you could say.
And then there's that phrase, hidden mysteries of nature and science. Now, Ward doesn't seem to think this is just referring to what we would consider, early forms of scientific inquiry. It sounds like he's hinting at something a bit more esoteric, maybe even bordering on what we might call occult powers.
Right, but he stresses that historically it was believed that these powers, these deeper mysteries, could only be safely accessed by someone with the highest moral character.
So it's not just about knowledge for knowledge's sake.
Not at all. There's a strong ethical backbone running through the craft. It's about responsible application of that knowledge.
And then he gets into the idea of wages. Obviously, in this context, we're not talking about a paycheck or anything like that. Ward interprets these wages as the power to comprehend God.
Yes. And he says that this power manifests within what he calls the middle chamber of the soul. So it's a very personal, almost internal reward tied to understanding.
So it's not just handed to you. You have to earn it through effort and study.
In a way, yes. The spiritual benefits that someone gets from Freemasonry, according to Ward, they're not automatic. It depends on your desire and your ability to grasp these deeper meanings. You get out what you put in, I suppose you could say.
Makes sense. And in this context, the employers are actually identified as the Divine Trinity.
Right, and Ward makes an interesting point here about the importance of justice, almost as a sort of, a counterpoint to the idea that God's love just means you get things for free. He's saying, no, there's also a balance, a divine justice, where the rewards reflect the effort and the understanding you've achieved.
It's a reminder that those two things aren't mutually exclusive. Divine love and divine justice, they go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
And even the names of the junior and senior wardens' pillars, which, on the surface just sound like architectural terms, Ward says they actually have deeper Kabbalistic significance.
Yeah, they're not just random names. They tie into concepts like moral virtue, preparation, and ultimately, the trial involved in becoming a master mason. It's amazing how everything is so interconnected, how those earlier elements foreshadow what's to come in the third degree.
It's like a roadmap, isn't it, with clues embedded along the way. And Ward even mentions something else interesting. He talks about the right that lodge members have to ask questions, which is something that he says is rarely exercised. He even gives an example. What was the name of the man who cast the two great pillars?
That's right. And it might seem like a simple question, but he suggests it has a deeper connection to what the candidate is about to experience.
Because the candidate is about to symbolically take on the role of that very person.
Exactly. It's a way of subtly preparing the mind for the central narrative of the Master Mason degree.
All right, let's talk about passwords. So for entering a raised third-degree lodge, there's a specific password. And Ward's description of its function, I find this really fascinating. He describes it almost like aligning yourself with higher spiritual vibrations, like tuning a radio to the right frequency.
Yes. And he even goes so far as to compare it to magical ceremonies, where specific words are used to resonate with particular energetic frequencies. It's about achieving the right state of consciousness to participate in the ritual.
Now, here's where it gets a little tricky. The passwords associated with the second and third degrees weren't always in their current order.
Right. Around 1740, they were actually flipped. The word that's now used for the third degree, TC, originally belonged to the second degree, and the word for the second degree, sh, was actually for the third.
So they reverse. And what's the reason for that switch?
Well, it's not entirely clear, but this change, it actually became a point of contention, especially for the ancients within Freemasonry who saw it as a departure from the original landmarks.
So what's the symbolic lesson we can draw from the current order of the words?
Ward suggests that the fellow craft, associated with the word shush, learns that simple necessities are enough, while the Master Mason, with the word TC, is being taught that clinging to worldly possessions can lead to spiritual death.
That's a pretty stark contrast.
It is. It's a reminder that materialism can be a trap on the spiritual path.
Now, War also mentions that the original password for the third degree, shush, had connection to John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, specifically that river of death.
Yes, but that connection has become less obvious since the words were switched around, though he mentions you can still see echoes of it in the tracing board imagery.
Okay, so there are these layers of meaning that have been, I guess you could say, obscured over time.
Right, but they're still there for those who know how to look for them.
And there's this really interesting linguistic analysis of those two words by a brother Sanderson. He suggests shh could mean ear of corn or fall of water. And TC originally meant blacksmith, which he says is similar to a word meaning acquisition, and potentially even linked to the Greek word tymboxon, which means to be entombed. And that, of course, connects back to the Hiram Abiff legend, which we'll get to later.
So much packed into two simple words. Craftsmanship, nature, allegory, even foreshadowing. It's quite remarkable.
It really is. So just to sum up this part, Ward is saying that these passwords are not just random sounds. They carry a lot of meaning. And when a candidate enters the lodge in the third degree, they're symbolically taking on the role of Hiram Abiff.
It's like stepping into a part in a sacred drama.
Okay, so we've talked about the lead up to the third degree, but what about the preparation itself? How does someone get ready for this degree?
Well, Ward points out that there are actually differences in how it's done depending on the Masonic jurisdiction.
Okay, so give us an example.
Well, in Irish workings, for instance, the way the cable tow, that symbolic rope is unwound, it's done in stages.
And what do those stages represent?
They symbolize a gradual liberation from different levels of sin, starting with the body, then the soul, and finally the spirit. So it's like a step-by-step purification process.
And how does that compare to, say, English or Scotch workings?
Well, in those traditions, the preparation is more uniform. It's about a holistic consecration of the whole being.
So it's less about specific stages and more about an overall dedication.
Exactly.
And despite these variations, Ward stresses that this preparation is all about symbolically consecrating yourself, both your active and passive aspects, to something higher. And he also says that the previous explanations about being suitably prepared, those still apply here. Now, another interesting detail. The way you knock on the lodge door actually changes between the fellow craft and Master Mason degrees.
Yeah, there's a subtle but important difference there. The fellow craft knock is said to symbolize the union of the soul and body, but the spirit is still sort of outside, waiting.
And for a Master Mason.
The Master Mason knock signifies that the spirit is now dominant and in union with the soul. The body kind of takes a back seat at this point. It reflects that shift towards a more spiritual focus that we've been talking about.
Like the inner hierarchy is changing.
Exactly. And one more thing to keep in mind here. The lodge itself has been raised to the third degree. It's undergone a transformation through a separate ceremony.
So it's not just the candidate who's being prepared, it's the whole space.
That's right. The lodge itself becomes symbolically different, ready for the events that are about to unfold.
So now the lodge is open in the third degree. What happens next?
The worshipful master starts by making sure that everyone present is, symbolically upright and of good moral standing. It's like a reaffirmation of the foundation upon which the craft is built.
So this is sort of symbolic purification.
In a way, yes. It's about making sure that the space and the people within it are aligned with those core principles.
Makes sense.
And then the junior warden is tested. He's tested with the compasses, which represent spiritual law, and the square, which symbolizes moral conduct.
And Ward points out that when you consider those two tools together, they form that lozenge shape, which is itself symbolic of the Vesica-Piscis. So many layers of symbolism here.
It's like symbolism within symbolism. And the Vesica-Piscis, that has a long history of being associated with creation and the feminine principle. So it's not just a random shape.
And he goes into more detail about the compasses themselves. They're used to create various geometrical figures. The circle, for example, represents eternity and spirit. The triangle symbolizes the Trinity.
And the key point he makes is that one point of the compasses is always fixed at the center.
What's the significance of that?
It represents the divine, the unmoving center around which everything else revolves. It's that unwavering presence at the heart of it all.
And he then goes on to interpret the compasses as representing the divine spark within every person.
Yes, including our conscience. It's that inner voice that guides our moral compass. It's a connection to the divine that's within each of us.
It's like our own personal connection to that fixed point at the center of everything.
Exactly. And this leads into what Ward calls the Great Quest, the soul's journey towards realizing and becoming one with God. And he frames this as a timeless, mystic quest. It's a journey from the east, representing light and God, to the west, symbolizing darkness and ultimately death.
So it's like a grand cosmic narrative.
It is, and it reflects a universal yearning for connection with the divine source, a longing to return to that place of light.
And the east, because it's seen as the origin point of the soul, that place where the soul emanated from God's substance, it brings with it this sense of separation, a feeling of loss, and a longing for return.
Like we're all spiritual exiles trying to find our way back home.
And the western portal, often associated with death, that's seen as the path, the necessary transition point, through which finite beings can eventually come to comprehend the infinite.
Although Ward does mention that there are rare exceptions, those individuals who achieve a kind of divine vision or communion while still living.
So like mystics and saints.
Exactly. Those who have somehow transcended the usual limitations of human perception.
But for most of us, it's a journey that leads through death.
And through that transition, that experience of death, Ward says that the recovery of what he calls the lost secrets can begin. It's as if death allows the soul and spirit to rediscover these truths. But, he emphasizes, it also creates a barrier. Those who have passed can't directly communicate that knowledge back to those who are still living as fellow crafts.
So that's a one-way journey in terms of sharing those specific insights.
Right. The veil of death prevents direct communication. It's a transformative boundary.
And even with that partial rediscovery after death, Ward stresses that the true, ultimate secrets are not something you'll find fully revealed within the craft rituals themselves. They remain linked to the center, which he equates with God, and are only attainable through extended spiritual journeys that occur after death. It's like the craft is just a starting point, a set of initial instructions for a much longer and more expansive journey.
It provides the framework, the tools, the guidance, but the true depths of understanding require a lot more than just the earthly rituals.
But even with that separation at death, Ward reminds us that the divine spark within each of us is never truly severed from the source.
It remains connected like that fixed point in the compasses. No matter what experiences we go through, that connection endures.
I like the way he visualizes that connection. He says that the 2 points of the compasses can be seen as representing the spirit at the center and the soul at the moving arm, while the body is represented by the whole circumference of the circle. It's like a map of our being.
A very clear way to understand the different aspects of ourselves and how they relate to the divine.
And the great quest, this journey towards union with God, it leads through death. And that death is symbolically portrayed in the Master Mason ceremony. And Ward also makes it clear that this search, this quest, it doesn't end at physical death. It actually continues beyond what we traditionally think of as death, even into higher degrees within Freemasonry, like the Royal Arch. It's presented as an ongoing evolution of understanding.
So it's not just a linear progression. It's more like a spiral that keeps unfolding.
I like that image, the spiral. And Ward emphasizes that the body alone, the physical part of us, can't achieve this full realization of God. And he says that this is why Hiram Abiff, the central figure in all of this, couldn't reveal the ultimate secrets without also having his soul and spirit fully integrated. It requires the whole self to truly know the divine.
It's about the integration of all our faculties, the physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual all working together.
And during the ceremony, the worshipful master actually promises spiritual assistance in raising the candidate from the grave. But Ward is careful to point out that the true secret, that remains elusive. It requires further spiritual development that goes beyond this particular degree.
It's like the craft gives you the tools and the guidance, but the true understanding, that's something you have to cultivate within yourself.
So it's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly.
And here's something I found really interesting. Ward mentions that the invocation used in this degree, it actually calls upon a very specific aspect of the Trinity.
Right. It's more akin to the all-embracing aspect rather than the destroyer aspect that's sometimes associated with trinities.
And he connects this to the Hindu concept of the circle with a point in the center, which represents the Most High in Hinduism.
It's about invoking a particular quality of the divine, one that's more about unity and wholeness.
And then there's this fascinating detail about Scotch Masonic rituals. Ward mentions that in the first degree, they open the volume of sacred law with the phrase, "In the beginning was the Word," and close it with, "And the Word was with God." And then he draws a connection to the phrase, "at," or with the C, which is used in the third degree, suggesting that the lost word they're seeking is actually the Logos, or Christ.
Yeah, it's a pretty strong link to a specifically Christian interpretation, even within a ritual that has much older roots.
So what's Ward saying here? That Freemasonry is essentially a Christian organization.
Not quite. He acknowledges that Freemasonry has pre-Christian origins, but he's also saying that the craft ceremonies, especially those in the higher degrees, definitely lend themselves to a Christian interpretation. He even says that the third degree, and those that come after it, are particularly rich in this respect.
So there's room for both interpretations, the Christian and the pre-Christian.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that makes Freemasonry so fascinating. It has this ability to resonate with people from a variety of spiritual backgrounds.
Okay, so we've laid a lot of groundwork here. Let's actually get into the ceremony itself. How does it all unfold?
All right, so the candidate enters, and they're admitted on the compasses. And Ward highlights the significance of one arm of the compasses being at the center. That represents the heart being aligned with the divine.
Even as the other arm is moving, so it's like holding on to that connection even as you're engaged with the world.
Exactly. And then those compasses are connected back to the square from the second degree. And together they form that vesica Pisces shape that we were talking about earlier, which symbolizes rebirth.
So the candidate is passing through a symbolic gateway.
Yeah, it's a transition into a new state of being. And then, during the invocation, the candidate kneels. And the deacons hold their wands crossed above the candidate's head, forming a triangle.
Which represents the spirit.
Right. And that triangle connects back to the lozenge shape, which, remember, comes from the vesica Pisces. So we've got this interplay of the square representing matter and the compasses representing spirit. And that all ties back to this idea of rebirth and spiritual transformation.
And Ward points out that this kneeling posture with the triangle above, it's not unique to Freemasonry. It's found in other ancient rites, like the Chinese Society of Heaven and Earth, for example.
Which suggests a common thread, a shared language of symbolism that goes beyond cultural boundaries.
And after that, the candidate undertakes 3 symbolic journeys.
The first one involves satisfying the junior warden, who represents the body, by demonstrating the good moral character expected of an enter apprentice.
Okay, so that's like the foundation, right?
Yeah.
Morality.
Right. And the second journey is about satisfying the senior warden, who's associated with the soul, by showing that you've learned from life's lessons and acquired intellectual knowledge.
So it's building on that moral foundation with wisdom.
Exactly. And then we get to the third journey.
And this one's a bit more complex, right?
Yeah. The candidate is challenged again, this time by the soul, for the password. But now the candidate is weighed down with symbolic worldly possessions, things that represent the seeds of spiritual death.
And they're unknowingly representing the metal worker who built the pillars.
which means they're about to go through a symbolic death, a metaphorical entombment. Remember that Greek word we talked about, timboxin?
And the soul then presents the candidate to the spirit as someone who's prepared to step into the role of their predecessor, Hiram Abiff. So it's a kind of handover, right, from one level of being to another.
Exactly. It's a symbolic elevation.
And something I noticed here in this part of the ceremony, both deacons are required to lead the candidate, which is different from the previous degrees where it's usually just one.
Right. And Ward draws an analogy to the Royal Arch ceremony, where a principal sojourner is also assisted by two others, forming a sort of trinity, and only one of them actually enters the grave. So there seems to be something significant about this duality, this need for two guides.
And there's this interesting interpretation by Brother Sanderson. He says that in many cultures, stepping over something was considered a sacrilegious act.
Right, so he suggests that having both deacons present prevents the soul and spirit, represented by the deacons, from descending into the grave with the body. It's a way of maintaining those symbolic boundaries.
And Ward makes a great point about how these kind of details, these little ritualistic nuances, they often survive all sorts of revisions and updates to the ceremonies.
It shows a real dedication to preserving the deeper meaning, even when the outer forms change.
Okay, so we've got the two deacons leading the candidate, and then what happens?
They take a series of steps, which Ward says form the shape of a Latin cross.
Symbolizing suffering and sacrifice.
Yes, and he connects the directions they face during those steps, north, south, east, to the different attempts Hiram Abiff made to escape from the temple.
And the master who's leading the candidate through this, he's said to be symbolically treading the cross of Calvary, thus consecrating the temple.
It's incredibly powerful imagery, layering the candidate's experience onto those ancient narratives.
And Ward even draws a parallel to the medieval practice of consecrating churches, where they would use dedication crosses, sometimes painted in red. He suggests that Hiram's final act was to begin the consecration of the temple with his own blood, a task that was then completed by King Solomon.
So the candidate, in a symbolic sense, is mirroring that act of consecration.
It's like they're dedicating their own being as a sacred space.
Exactly. And it connects to those older traditions of literally marking sacred spaces with blood.
And Ward also mentions the accusations that were leveled against the Knights Templar. Remember, they were accused of trampling the cross.
And he links that to the steps that the candidate takes. It's a reminder that even sacred rituals can be misinterpreted or even twisted by those who don't understand them.
It shows how easily symbolism can be taken out of context. So what are the deeper interpretations of these steps?
Well, from a Christian perspective, they can be seen as the way of the cross leading to Calvary and resurrection.
But Ward also says that on a more general level, they represent the sacrifice that's necessary for anyone seeking truth, regardless of their religious beliefs. It's that universal idea of having to give something up to make a sacrifice in order to attain higher knowledge.
Exactly.
And the number of steps is also significant. It's a combination of 3 and 4, which Ward connects to the Trinity and the 4 elements, as well as the idea of the perfect lodge and the 7 elements of a human being.
It all adds up to a symbolic representation of the complete dedication of the self, body, soul, and spirit.
It's like offering your whole being to this quest for truth.
Yes. And then comes the obligation.
But what's unique about the obligation in this degree,
It requires a master mason's lodge to be open on the center.
which Ward interprets as the heart's secret chamber, the seat of the divine spark within.
It's not just about a physical location, it's about an inner state. It's saying that the true work of a master mason's lodge takes place on a spiritual level.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then there's the penal sign, which is given in a very particular way in this degree.
And Ward points out that it actually resembles the way ashes are scattered to the 4 winds in Hindu cremation practices that are associated with Shiva, the destroyer.
It's a link to a very ancient tradition of honoring the transformative power of death and destruction.
And finally, he notes how the positions of the square and compasses are reversed in this degree.
Right. The compasses, representing the spirit, are now placed above the square, which represents the body. It shows that the spirit has achieved dominance. It's a symbol of spiritual mastery.
So we've gone through the preparation, the opening of the lodge, and some of the key symbolic actions and obligations. But what about the actual narrative, the story of Hiram Abiff?
Right. That's the core of the Master Mason degree.
And Ward points out that the exhortation that's given in this degree, it actually summarizes that symbolic journey that the candidate has been through. birth, life, and then symbolic death.
It's like taking stock of where you've been and what you've experienced.
And then he reminds us of the esoteric interpretation of the fellowcraft degree, the idea of discovering God's name and transforming Jehovah into Jeheshu, a figure who's raised on the cross of Tifereth, all those Kabbalistic concepts.
And he notes that the New Testament also offers a similar interpretation for those with a Christian perspective, maybe bypassing those more complex Kabbalistic details.
So again, different ways of understanding the same symbolism.
Exactly. And this is where things start to get really dramatic, with variations in the rituals that go beyond what you find in the standardized emulation workings.
So different jurisdictions will have their own way of presenting this part of the ceremony.
That's right. And he even mentions how the positions of the wardens and deacons can vary, sometimes forming triangles to represent spirit, sometimes squares to represent matter. The geometry of the lodge itself plays a role in the symbolism.
And there are even variations in how the attack on Hiram Abiff is portrayed, whether it happens in the north or the west, and the different names that are given to the attackers.
Yeah, like Jubila, Jubilo, Jubilum.
And Ward suggests those names might actually connect to AUM, the Hindu trinity of creation, preservation, and destruction.
So again, we see these hints of older traditions woven into the fabric of the ceremony.
And Ward describes how, in some rituals, particularly those of the Scotch tradition, there are these perambulations around the lodge with specific signs given at each round representing the different degrees. And it all culminates in what's called the lion's grip.
And he actually laments the fact that that particular grip has fallen out of use in some places, like London, because he sees it as being so symbolically important.
And then there's the practice of placing the candidate in a coffin or a grave.
Right. And Ward points out that some Dutch rituals even include a skeleton in this part of the ceremony.
So they're really driving home this idea of death and resurrection.
Absolutely. And that, Ward says, is the primary meaning of this whole degree, preparing the individual for death and hinting at the possibility of an afterlife.
And he compares the Masonic version of this to the Osiris myth in Egypt. But he notes a key difference. In the Masonic legend, it's only Hiram's body that's raised. There's no mention of his soul.
Yeah, that's a significant distinction.
And Ward explores the idea of raising the corpse and placing it upright, drawing parallels to other ancient myths, like the story of Hercules rescuing Alcestis from death, or Isis reassembling Osiris. And he points out that even Anubis, the Egyptian god of embalming, is often depicted raising Osiris in a way that's very similar to the Master Mason's raising.
So we see this recurring theme of bringing something back from the dead, restoring life.
It seems like a very ancient, maybe even archetypal idea.
Right. And Ward says that the specific grip that's used, the lion's paw, and the way the candidate is raised, it's not unique to Freemasonry at all. He points out that it's found in all sorts of traditions around the world, among the dervishes, in West African cultures, even in Native American and Druidic ceremonies.
So this gesture seems to have a truly global presence.
It's a sign of recognition among initiates in all these different traditions, representing a kind of shared understanding of these mysteries.
And he digs into the deeper meaning of the lion's grip, drawing on Brother Sanderson's research. He connects the supreme god, Ra or Osiris, in the Egyptian Book of the Dead to a concept of a god in lion form.
And that lion god is said to rise from the grave in the east, just like the sun.
It's a solar symbol representing rebirth.
Exactly. And the lion itself, it embodies strength, power, and that regenerative aspect of the sun. It represents the triumph over death.
And Ward even connects this to the bright morning star that's often mentioned in Masonic ritual. He says that it likely refers to Sirius, the dog star, which was seen in ancient Egypt as a bringer of peace and salvation, because its rising coincided with the annual flooding of the Nile.
That flooding was essential for their survival, so it's no wonder they associated Sirius with those qualities.
And Sirius was also venerated in many other cultures around the world. Even the orientation of Egyptian temples and some British stone circles is linked to Sirius.
So this star clearly had a major significance for our ancestors.
And on a more spiritual level, Ward explains that the bright morning star is seen as the first fruits of resurrection, a symbol of hope and redemption. He even mentions that some Masonic scholars, like Dunkerley, interpreted it as the Star of Bethlehem representing Christ.
So again, we see that layering of Christian symbolism onto older concepts.
Okay, so we've got the lion's grip, the bright morning star, and now the candidate is symbolically raised from the grave.
Yeah.
And they receive the substitute secrets.
Right, and that's something that Ward acknowledges might cause some confusion. He says that these are not the original general secrets, they're substitutes.
And what's the reason for that?
Well, the usual explanation is that the original secrets were lost with Hiram Abiff, but Ward argues that that's not really a satisfactory explanation.
Because King Solomon, according to other Masonic traditions, had those secrets and even wrote them down.
Exactly. So Ward suggests that the real reason for the substitute secrets is more allegorical. He's saying that the true nature of God, those ultimate secrets, can't be simply passed on from one person to another.
You can't just tell someone what it is. They have to experience it for themselves.
It's about an inner realization, not just acquiring knowledge.
And that full realization, that union with the divine, Ward says that's not something that's fully achievable in this life. It requires a long, ongoing spiritual journey that extends beyond physical death.
It's a quest that continues long after we leave this earthly plane.
So substitute secrets are like a kind of placeholder, a promise of something more to come.
That's a good way to put it. And Ward suggests that those substitute secrets actually evolve out of the fellow craft degree, where the real secret was the transformation of Jehovah into Jeheshu.
Representing the birth of the Christ spirit within.
Right. And the third degree takes that a step further by symbolizing a mystical death and resurrection, like that of Jesus.
It's like those 2 degrees are showing 2 halves of a larger spiritual process.
Yes.
Okay, so the candidate receives the substitute secrets. And what else happens in this part of the ceremony?
They're also given a series of signs, and Ward points out